My name is Arthur. I'm what you'd call a simple man, a carpenter for most of my life. And I am here to tell you about the day my own family handed me my inheritance with one hand and a heap of shame with the other. In the stale air of a lawyer's office, my brother-in-law, Mark, looked me square in the eye and said, "Congratulations, Arthur. You finally own the most famous landmark in town, a monument to failure." He said it with a smirk, loud enough for everyone to hear. A monument to failure. That's what my grandfather's life's work had become in their eyes, and now it was mine. The weight of those words was heavier than any stone. What would you do if the people who are supposed to have your back are the first ones to laugh at your misfortune? Listen to my story until the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Also, let me know from which city you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. The lawyer's office was small and stuffy, smelling of old paper and lukewarm coffee that had been sitting out for hours. I felt out of place from the moment I walked in. I was still in my work pants, the ones with a faint scent of sawdust that never quite washes out. My nephew, David, sat across from me, looking sharp in a city suit that cost more than my monthly pension. He's in real estate, and he looks at everything and everyone like a property to be valued or dismissed. He kept checking his watch, his impatience a silent judgment in itself. The lawyer, a tired man named Mr. Gable, just wanted to get through the paperwork. He had no stake in this. He was just the messenger. But for me, that room felt like a courtroom where I had already been found guilty of something, though I wasn't yet sure what my crime was. The crime, it turned out, was inheriting my grandfather's old general store. Finch & Sons Mercantile. The sign above the boarded-up windows still read, though it was faded and peeling. It had been closed for 40 years, a silent, dusty giant on Main Street. When Mr. Gable announced I was the sole inheritor, David let out a little scoff, a puff of air that said everything. But it was Mark who delivered the blow. He leaned back in his squeaky chair, a broad, self-satisfied man who measured a person's worth by the size of their bank account. He didn't just say the words. He savored them, performing for David and the lawyer. "What are you going to do with all those cobwebs and rat droppings?" he added, laughing. The sound bounced off the wood-paneled walls, and the silence that followed felt deafening. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, like it was closing up. I just stared down at my own hands, resting on my knees. These hands had built houses, fixed furniture, and held my wife, Eleanor, through her long illness. They were rough, calloused hands that knew the meaning of hard work, and in that moment they felt completely useless. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for a reaction, for me to get angry or try to defend myself. But I gave them nothing. I just focused on the worn creases in my knuckles and thought of my grandfather. He was a stern man, but fair. He would never have stood for such disrespect. But he was gone, and I was alone in that room with the wolves. Mr. Gable cleared his throat, trying to move things along. He pushed a single, rusty key across the polished surface of the desk. It was a heavy, old-fashioned skeleton key, the kind you don't see anymore. The metal was cold and pitted against my skin when I finally reached out and closed my fist around it. It didn't feel like a key to a property. It felt like a key to a prison of ridicule. It was the physical proof of what they thought of me, that I was only fit to inherit dust and decay. I stood up, mumbled a thank you to the lawyer, and walked out without looking at Mark or David again. The weight of that key in my pocket felt like a stone, and their laughter seemed to follow me all the way down the hall, a mocking echo that I knew would stay with me for a long, long time. My life didn't start with much, and I never asked for much more. I was born right here in Oakhaven, back when the town had a little more life in its veins. My father worked at the old lumber mill, and my mother raised 3 of us in a house that always smelled of baking bread and clean laundry. The lesson in our house was simple. You work for what you have, you don't complain about the splinters you get along the way, and you look a man in the eye when you shake his hand. There was an honor in being tired at the end of the day. It meant you'd earned your rest. It was a straightforward life, and it taught me that a person's worth isn't in their wallet, but in the strength of their back and the honesty of their word. That's a currency folks like my nephew David don't seem to understand. I took up carpentry not because I had some grand artistic vision, but because I liked the feel of wood in my hands. I liked taking something rough and shapeless and turning it into something useful, something solid that could shelter a family or hold their dinner table steady. I learned from an old man named Jedediah, who never used a power tool if a hand tool would do the job right. He taught me to listen to the grain, to respect the material. It was a slow, deliberate craft, and it suited my nature. I was never one for big talk or fancy schemes. I just wanted to build things that would last, things that people could rely on. It felt like an honest way to move through the world, leaving behind something better than what you found. I met my Eleanor at the county fair. She was serving lemonade at her church's booth, and her smile was so bright it could have outshone the Midway lights. I was a clumsy young man, covered in a fine layer of sawdust as usual, but she didn't seem to mind. She laughed at my awkward jokes, and had a kindness in her eyes that I'd never seen before. We started walking together after that, along the creek that runs behind the town, talking about everything and nothing. With her, I didn't feel so quiet or out of place. It felt like I'd found the missing piece of a puzzle I didn't even know I was trying to solve. She saw the man I was, not the dirt under my fingernails. We didn't have a big wedding, just a small service with family and a few close friends. We used what little money we had to buy a small plot of land and started building our own house, board by board. I'd work at my jobs during the day, and we'd work on the house in the evenings and on weekends, Eleanor right there beside me, hammering nails and painting walls. We had a dream, a simple one. I was going to open my own little workshop, Finch Fine Furniture, and she would handle the books. It wasn't a plan for getting rich. It was a plan for being happy, for building a life together with our own two hands. Those were the best days, full of hard work and the simple joy of creating our future. That old general store was a big part of my childhood. Before it was a monument to failure, as Mark so elegantly put it, it was the beating heart of Oak Haven. I remember my grandfather, a tall, stern man with a kind crinkle around his eyes, standing behind that massive oak counter. The place had a smell all its own, a mix of coffee beans, pipe tobacco, leather, and that dusty sweet scent of the candy jars. He'd let me stand on a stool and weigh out nails on the big brass scale, and if I was good, he'd slip me a piece of horehound candy. It was more than a store. It was where you heard the town news, where farmers debated the weather, and where a handshake was a binding contract. My grandfather was a man of quiet integrity. He never preached about charity, he just lived it. I remember seeing him, more than once, slip an extra bag of flour or sugar into the groceries of a family he knew was struggling, pretending it was a mistake on his part. He'd let farmers run a tab until their crops came in, never charging a cent of interest. He believed a community was like a barn raising. Everyone had to pull their own weight, but you also had to be there to lift the beam for your neighbor when they couldn't manage it alone. He taught me that true strength isn't about how much you can accumulate for yourself, but how much you can support the folks around you without ever asking for thanks. I was a young man when the store finally closed its doors. It wasn't a sudden failure. It was a slow bleed. A bigger, shinier supermarket opened up in the next county, and people started driving there for cheaper prices. Slowly, the life drained out of Finch & Sons. I remember the day my grandfather nailed the boards over the front windows. He didn't say much, but I saw the slump in his shoulders. It was like he was sealing up a part of his own history, a part of the town's soul. The silence that fell over that corner of Main Street was heavy. It was the end of an era, and we all felt it. Our dream of the workshop was getting closer. Eleanor and I had saved every spare dollar, and we finally bought that little plot of land just on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a couple of acres with a big oak tree in the middle, but to us, it was everything. I remember one Sunday afternoon, standing there with her, the sun warm on our faces. I held her hand, and I promised her, "One day, Eleanor, right here, we'll build it right here, and I'll make you the most beautiful rocking chair you've ever seen, to put on the porch." It was a sacred promise, made on our own piece of earth. It felt real, tangible, something we could almost touch. Then, life threw us a curve we couldn't hit. Eleanor started getting tired. Then, the pains began. It started small, the way a storm builds on the horizon, almost unnoticeable at first. Then came the doctor's appointments, the tests, and the words that changed everything. A long illness, they called it. A battle she would have to fight. The world we had been so carefully building suddenly felt fragile, like a house of cards in a strong wind. Her bright smile started to dim, replaced by a quiet, brave weariness. And my role in our life together began to shift in a way I never imagined. There was no real decision to be made. The medical bills started piling up like snowdrifts in a blizzard. The plot of land, our dream, was the only thing of value we had. I sold it. I didn't even hesitate. My brother-in-law, Mark, told me I was a fool, that I was selling at a loss and throwing good money after bad. He saw it as a failed business transaction. He couldn't understand that it wasn't about the money or the land. It was about Eleanor. It was about giving her a chance, about buying her more time, more comfort, more days. I would have sold my own soul for one more good day with her. The land was just dirt and grass compared to that. The years that followed were hard. My world shrank to the size of our little house. I became her nurse, her cook, her companion. My hands, which had spent a lifetime shaping wood, now learned to measure medicine, to fluff pillows, to hold her hand through long, painful nights. I read to her from old books, and we'd talk about the life we'd had, remembering the good times. The world outside our windows faded away. My work became her. And in all that sadness, there was a strange kind of peace. I was where I was supposed to be, doing what I was supposed to do. I was keeping the most important promise of all, to be there, in sickness and in health. One of her last good days, we took a short, slow walk down Main Street. She leaned heavily on my arm, but she was determined. We stopped in front of the old boarded-up store. She looked at it for a long time, and a little smile touched her lips. "I remember buying the blue ribbons for my hair in there," she said, her voice a soft whisper. "Your grandfather always gave me an extra inch." We just stood there for a few minutes, two ghosts on a quiet street, looking at the ghost of a building. It was a moment heavy with memories, both ours and the town's. It was the last time we ever walked down that street together. Losing her was like having the sun burn out. The silence in the house was a physical thing, a presence that filled every room. For weeks, I'd wake up and start to make her coffee before I remembered. The routines that had structured our lives for so long were suddenly gone, and I was adrift. The grief was a deep, dark well, and I was afraid if I looked into it for too long, I'd fall in and never get out. My work was the only thing that saved me. I started taking on any small carpentry job I could find, not for the money, but to keep my hands and my mind busy from sunrise to sunset. After Eleanor was gone, I could feel how the rest of the family saw me. To Mark and David, I was a cautionary tale. An old man with a meager pension, living in a small house, with nothing to show for a lifetime of work. They saw my devotion to Eleanor not as love, but as poor financial planning. They saw my simple life not as a choice, but as a failure to achieve anything more. They measured my life with their yardstick of money and assets, and they found it lacking. They never understood that I had been the richest man in the world when she was by my side. So when that lawyer pushed that rusty key across the desk, it was about so much more than an old, dilapidated building. It was about that legacy of quiet strength my grandfather left behind. It was about the memory of my last walk with Eleanor. It was about a life lived by a different set of rules than theirs. Their laughter wasn't just mocking a building. It was mocking my entire existence, everything I had ever held sacred. They were laughing at the love, the sacrifice, and the quiet dignity I had tried to live by. And as I stood there, I knew I couldn't let their version of the story be the final one. That key in my pocket felt heavier than a simple piece of metal. It was the weight of my past, the weight of their judgment, and the weight of a legacy they had dismissed as worthless. Walking out of that office, I didn't feel defeated. I felt a slow, burning fire ignite deep inside me. It wasn't anger, not really. It was determination. They saw a monument to failure. But I remembered the man who built it. I remembered the love it represented. And I was going to honor that, whether they understood it or not. The story of Finch & Sons Mercantile wasn't over. A new chapter was about to begin, and I was going to be the one to write it. The first time I stood in front of the store with that key in my hand, the weight of it felt different. It was no longer just the weight of their scorn, but the weight of responsibility. The sun was setting, casting long shadows down Main Street, making the boarded-up facade look even more imposing, more final. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and approaching evening chill, and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant, grinding screech, like a joint that hadn't been moved in decades. The heavy oak door groaned open, revealing not a room, but a tomb. A thick, almost tangible darkness hung in the air, disturbed only by the single beam of light from the open door, which illuminated a swirling universe of dust motes. The silence inside was profound, a silence that felt older than I was. My first trip to the diner after that day at the lawyer's office was a lesson in itself. It's a small place, Millie's Diner, where everyone knows everyone's business. As I pushed open the glass door, the usual hum of conversation seemed to dip for a second. Just a brief pause before it picked back up, a little too loudly. I took my usual seat at the counter, and Millie poured my coffee without her usual cheerful greeting. I could feel eyes on my back. I could hear whispers from a booth behind me, catching just a few words. The old Finch place. And then a low chuckle. Nobody said anything to me directly, but the message was as clear as the bell on the diner door. I had changed in their eyes. I was no longer just Arthur the carpenter. I was now the keeper of the town's biggest ruin. A few days later, the phone rang. It was Mark. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice had that slick, overly helpful tone he used when he was about to tell you something for your own good. "Arthur," he started, "I was just thinking about you in that situation. I have a friend in the demolition business. I could get you a good price, a real friendly deal. We could have that eyesore cleared out in a week, and you could sell the empty lot. Cut your losses, you know." He presented it as an act of kindness, a helping hand. But I knew what it was. It was another way of saying my inheritance was garbage. And I was a fool for even holding on to the key. I just said, "I'll think about it, Mark," and hung up the phone, the silence of my house feeling heavier than ever. The first real day of work was overwhelming. I propped the front door open for light and air, though the air that came in just seemed to stir up more ghosts of the past. The dust wasn't just a layer, it was a blanket, inches thick in some places, covering everything in a uniform shroud of gray. It was in my nose, in my throat, on my clothes. I started with a single broom in a small corner, and the cloud I raised was so thick I had to step outside, coughing and sputtering. I looked at the vast, shadowy expanse of the store, at the shelves still lined with decaying boxes and rusted cans, and a wave of pure futility washed over me. It felt like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. I was one man against 40 years of neglect, and I was completely, utterly alone. One afternoon, as I was hauling a bucket of filthy water out to the alley, I saw my old neighbor, Mrs. Gable, walking her little dog. She stopped and watched me for a moment, her face etched with a look of profound pity. It was the kind of look you give someone who has suffered a great loss. "Oh, Arthur," she said, her voice soft and sad. "That's such a heavy burden for you to carry." The next day, she brought over a chicken casserole, patting my arm and telling me to keep my strength up. She meant well. I know she did. but her kindness felt like a confirmation of my status as a charity case. It made me feel smaller, weaker, as if I were a patient in a hospital and the store was my terminal diagnosis. The final nail in that coffin came at my niece's summer barbecue, an event I only went to out of a lingering sense of family duty. I was standing by the grill, trying to feel like a part of things, when I overheard my nephew, David, talking to one of his cousins. He was gesturing vaguely in my direction. "He's spending his pension on it, you know," David said, his voice dripping with condescension, pouring what little he has into what Dad calls Arthur's folly. He laughed, and the cousin joined in. Arthur's Folly? The name stuck in my head, a cruel little jingle. It was perfect. It captured everything they thought of me and my grandfather's store. A foolish, sentimental old man wasting his last days on a pointless, crumbling dream. That's what I had become to them. After that barbecue, the isolation became more tangible. It was in the small, everyday interactions, or the lack thereof. When I walked down Main Street, I noticed people who had known me my whole life would suddenly find something fascinating to look at in a shop window as I approached. Some would even cross the street, a casual, almost unconscious maneuver to avoid having to speak to me. The friendly nods and "Morning Arthur" greetings dwindled, replaced by quick, averted glances. It was as if my inheritance had a contagious quality, and they were afraid of catching my failure. I started to feel like a ghost in my own town, a walking reminder of something everyone else wanted to forget. The loneliness was a cold, constant companion. Even a simple trip to the hardware store became a small trial. I needed supplies: heavy-duty trash bags, work gloves, a new crowbar. The young man behind the counter, a kid whose grandfather I'd built a porch for, asked what I was working on. When I told him I was cleaning out the old mercantile, he just stared for a second, then let out a low whistle. "Man, that place. Good luck," he said, not with encouragement, but with a kind of morbid curiosity, like I'd just told him I was going to try and swim across the ocean. He rang up my items, and as I left, I heard him say to his coworker, "Can you believe it?" Every transaction, every conversation, was a fresh reminder that the entire town had already decided my fate. I was on a fool's errand. The work inside the store was slow and punishing. Each cleared shelf, each swept patch of floor, revealed another layer of decay. One day, I was trying to clean a glass display counter near the front. As I wiped away decades of grime, I saw the faint scratches on the glass and was hit by a memory so sharp it made me catch my breath. It was of Eleanor, years ago, pressing her hand against that very spot, laughing at a display of colorful hair ribbons. "Oh, Art, look how pretty," she had said. Standing there in the dusty silence, the memory was both a comfort and a torment. It filled the empty space with her presence for a fleet second, only to make the subsequent silence and my profound loneliness feel even deeper. The sarcastic offers of help became a regular feature of my days. Old acquaintances, men I'd shared beers with after work for years, would slow their trucks as they passed the open doors. They'd lean out the window with a grin. "Hey, Arthur, you need a match? We could have a real nice bonfire here," one of them shouted one morning, laughing as he drove off. Another time, two guys who were on their way to go fishing stopped and peered inside. "Let us know when you're ready to knock it down," one said. "We'll bring the sledgehammers for free." They thought they were being funny, just harmless ribbing. But their jokes were all aimed at destruction, not restoration. No one ever offered to help me lift a box or swing a hammer for a good cause. The small pile of receipts for cleaning supplies, lumber for bracing a weak spot in the floor, and even new light bulbs began to grow on my kitchen table. I sat down one night with my bank statement and did the math. My pension was modest, enough to live on simply, but it wasn't meant for a project of this scale. A knot of cold fear tightened in my stomach. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly consider their perspective. What if they were right? What if I was pouring the last of my savings into a bottomless pit? A hole made of rotting wood and broken dreams. The thought was terrifying. a whisper of doubt that threatened to drown out the quiet resolve I was trying so hard to hold on to. Then came the silence that hurt the most. For the past 5 years, since Eleanor passed, I'd been part of a weekly poker game. Just a few of us old-timers, getting together in Frank's garage to play cards, drink cheap beer, and complain about our aching joints. It was a small thing, but it was a lifeline. I realized one Thursday evening that it had been over a month since anyone had called me. I knew why. They didn't want the ghost at the table. They didn't want to sit across from Arthur's Folly and have to make polite conversation about my doomed project. They had quietly, gently, cut me loose. The loss of that simple camaraderie felt like a final verdict. I was officially on the outside. There were moments, brief and fleeting, of something that felt like progress. I managed to clear one entire aisle, from front to back. I swept and scrubbed the floorboards until the rich, dark grain of the old oak started to show through the grime. For about an hour, standing in that one clean path amidst the chaos, I felt a surge of genuine pride. I could almost see it, almost feel what it used to be. But then I'd turn and look at the rest of the cavernous space, the mountains of debris and dirt that still remained, and the feeling would collapse. The small victory was swallowed by the sheer, overwhelming scale of the defeat that surrounded it. It was a cruel trick of the light, a flicker of hope in a vast darkness. Even the town historian, a woman I thought would surely see the value in what I was doing, became another voice of doubt. Her name was Beatrice, and she stopped by one afternoon, peering inside with a professional, appraising eye. She walked down my one clean aisle, tapping a floorboard with her sensible shoe. She looked around, at the sagging ceiling and the water-stained walls, and she just shook her head with a sigh. "It's a tragedy, Arthur," she said, her tone clinical. "A real piece of our history, but it's just too far gone. The structural damage alone. My advice: document what you can, salvage the fixtures, and sell the lot to a developer. It's the only practical thing to do." Coming from her, it felt like the final, expert opinion. The case was closed. That night, I didn't even bother to wash the grime off me when I got home. I just sat down in my old armchair, the dust from the store creating a faint cloud around me. I was sore in every bone, my hands were raw, and my spirit felt scraped clean. I looked around my small, quiet house, the house I built with Eleanor, and the full weight of it all finally crashed down on me. I saw myself as they saw me. A pathetic old man, clinging to a pile of rubble out of foolish sentimentality, pitied by his neighbors and mocked by his own family. I said the words out loud, tasting the bitterness of them in my mouth. The old fool with the worthless property. In the silence of the room, the words hung there, and for the first time, I believed them. But something strange happens when you hit the bottom. When you accept the worst thing that people think about you, it loses its power. Sitting there in my dusty clothes, in the dark, a different feeling started to bubble up from beneath the despair. It wasn't hope. It was something harder, colder. It was defiance. A stubborn, quiet fire that had been banked low for years began to glow. If I was the fool, then I would be the fool. If this was my folly, then I would see it through to the end. It was no longer about my grandfather, or Eleanor, or even the town. It was about me. It was about my refusal to let their judgment be the last word on my life. My dignity was not in their hands. It was in mine. With this newfound grim determination, I changed my strategy. The vast main room was too demoralizing. I needed a smaller battlefield, a place where I could win a decisive victory. The back office. It was a small, contained room behind the main counter, filled with old desks and rotting paperwork. It was manageable. If I could conquer that one room, if I could restore that small space to order, then I would have something real. I would have a foothold. The next morning, I didn't even look at the main store. I walked straight to the back, closed the office door behind me, and faced my new, smaller mountain. This is where I would make my stand. The office was dominated by a single piece of furniture, a massive, dark oak counter that served as a desk. It was covered in ledgers that had fused into solid blocks of moldy paper. My first task was to move it, to get it out of the way, so I could start on the floors and walls. I put my shoulder to it and pushed. Nothing. It didn't budge an inch. I tried from the other side. I tried to lift one corner. It was as if it were bolted to the very foundations of the earth. I spent the better part of the day wrestling with that single, immovable object. It was a perfect symbol of my struggle, heavy, stubborn, and rooted in the past. But as the sun went down, I didn't feel defeated. I just felt curious. I went home, got my new crowbar, and came back. I was going to find out what was holding it down. I wedged the crowbar under the lip of the massive oak counter, putting all my weight into it. The wood groaned, but the desk didn't move. It was fixed to the floor, solid as a mountain. It wasn't just old, it was stubborn. For 2 days, it had been my silent opponent in that small, dusty office. But a carpenter learns a thing or two about how things are put together. If it wasn't moving, something was holding it that wasn't supposed to be there. I stopped trying to force it and started looking underneath. I ran my hands along the grimy floorboards beneath the counter's deep overhang, feeling for bolts, for brackets. Instead, my fingers brushed against a seam where there shouldn't have been one. The floorboards weren't a single, continuous surface. They were cut. With a new sense of purpose, I used the tip of the crowbar to pry at that seam. The old wood splintered and moaned in protest, but then a single board came loose. Then another. It wasn't a repair patch. It was a deliberate, carefully concealed section of the floor. As I pulled away the last of the boards, my breath caught in my throat. There, flush with the concrete subfloor, was a flat, dark rectangle of iron. It was about 3 feet square, with a recessed dial and a small, keyless handle. It was the top of a floor safe, embedded in the very foundation of the building, and it had been hidden for at least 40 years, silent and waiting, right under my grandfather's feet. The sight of it sent a jolt through me, a feeling that was equal parts fear and a wild, electric thrill. This wasn't some cheap tin box. It was old, heavy-duty iron, the kind you'd see in a bank. There was no brand name, no markings, just the grim, functional look of pure security. The dial was stiff with age and grime, its numbers barely visible. For a moment I just stared at it, the silence of the office pressing in on me. This was something else. This changed the story. All the mockery, all the pity, all the whispers about Arthur's folly, they all seemed to fade away, replaced by the silent, imposing presence of this iron door in the floor. My grandfather was a simple man, a general store owner. What in the world did he have that needed to be protected like this? The question hung in the dusty air, and I knew with absolute certainty that my life was about to change. Getting it open wasn't a matter of force. I knew that much. I spent the next 3 days on my hands and knees in that office. I cleaned the dial carefully, using a soft brush and a little oil, just like I would with a delicate piece of machinery. I didn't have a combination, but I had a lifetime of working with my hands, of listening to the subtle language of materials. I put my ear to the cold iron, my fingers gentle on the dial, and I just listened. I turned it slowly, feeling for the faint clicks of the tumblers falling into place. It was a slow, painstaking process, a conversation with a lock that hadn't spoken in decades. On the 3rd afternoon, after countless failed attempts, I heard it. A deep, solid thunk that resonated through the iron and up into my bones. The handle turned. The heavy iron door was still a beast to lift. It groaned on its hinges, releasing a puff of air that smelled not of mold or decay, but of dry paper and time itself. I peered into the dark space, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was no pile of gold coins, no glittering jewels like you see in the movies. The inside of the safe was small and stark, and it held only 2 things. On one side was a neat stack of what looked like official documents, tied with a faded ribbon. On the other side was a single, thick book, a ledger bound in dark brown leather. My eyes went to the book first. It felt more important, more personal. It felt like the real reason for the safe's existence. The air in the room felt thin, and I had to remind myself to breathe. I reached in and carefully lifted out the stack of papers first. The ribbon disintegrated in my fingers. They were bearer bonds, issued by the United States Treasury. The paper was thick and crisp, the engraving intricate. The dates on them were from the early 1950s. I didn't know much about finances, not the way David or Mark did, but I knew what these were. These were promises, worth whatever value was printed on their face, payable to whoever held them. I sat back on my heels, the bonds in my hand, and looked around the decaying office. I did a quick, rough calculation in my head, and the number was so large it seemed fictional. It was a fortune. Not just enough to fix the store, but enough to live on for the rest of my life. And then some. It was staggering. But the funny thing is, after the initial shock, the money didn't feel like the main event. It felt like a tool, a means to an end. My real attention, my whole being, was focused on that leather book, still sitting in the safe. I gently placed the bonds aside and reached back in for the ledger. It was heavy in my hands, solid and substantial. The leather was worn smooth at the edges, a sign it had been handled often. There was no title on the cover, nothing to give away its contents. It was completely anonymous. I carried it over to the one clean spot I had, near the window where the afternoon light was strongest, and I sat down on an overturned bucket, my hands trembling just slightly as I opened the cover. The first page was blank, except for my grandfather's signature, Elias Finch. The pages that followed were filled with his handwriting, a neat, strong script that I recognized from old receipts. But this wasn't a record of store inventory or sales. This was a different kind of accounting. Each entry was a name, a date, and an amount of money. The date started in the late 1920s and ran all the way through the Depression and into the years after the war. Beside each entry were notes, written in a smaller hand. For seed grain, spring planting. To cover doctor's bill for the boy. To keep the bank from taking the house. These were loans. Dozens and dozens of loans, given to the people of Oakhaven when they were at their most desperate. And next to almost every single one, in the column where interest should have been calculated, he had simply drawn a firm, straight line. I felt a profound, aching sense of discovery, as if I were finally meeting the true version of the man I had only known in his later years. This ledger was the secret story of his life. It was a testament to a kind of wealth that my brother-in-law could never comprehend. He wasn't just a shopkeeper. He was the quiet, invisible pillar that had held this town up during its darkest days. He had saved farms, homes, and businesses, never asking for a cent of interest, never seeking a word of thanks. His charity was as silent and as solid as the safe he kept it in. He didn't want glory. He just wanted his neighbors to survive. I had to close my eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer, quiet decency of it all. Then I kept turning the pages, my hands now steady, my purpose clear. I was no longer just cleaning a store, I was excavating a history. And that's when I saw it. A name that made the air go out of my lungs. It was the name of Mark's grandfather. The entry was for a loan so substantial it must have been everything my grandfather had at the time. The note beside it read, "To prevent foreclosure on the farm." The very farm that had given Mark's family their start, the land they were so proud of, had been saved by the man whose legacy Mark now spat on. It was a debt of honor that had been completely and utterly forgotten, replaced by scorn and arrogance. I felt a cold, calm clarity settle over me. I turned a few more pages, almost knowing what I would find before I saw it. And there it was. Another name, from the early 1940s. David's great-grandfather. The entry was for the hardware business that had been in their family for generations. The note was simple: to cover debts and restock. The entire foundation of my nephew's comfortable life, his fancy suits, and his condescending attitude, was built on an act of silent generosity from the man he and his father dismissed as a failure. They were standing on the shoulders of a giant, all while mocking him for not being taller. The irony was so bitter, it tasted like rust. In that dusty, quiet office, holding that ledger, I finally understood. I wasn't the inheritor of a monument to failure. I was the keeper of a sacred trust. I was the sole guardian of a truth that rewrote the history of this town and, more importantly, the history of my own family. Their judgment of me, of my grandfather, of this store, was built on a lie they told themselves to feel superior. They had measured our lives with a broken ruler, blind to the real value of things. They saw dust and decay, but the real treasure was never the building itself. It was the integrity that was soaked into its very floorboards. This was the secret I was meant to find, not just the money, but the truth. It explained why my grandfather never sold the place, why he let it sit here, preserved in time. He was protecting this. He was protecting the dignity of the people he helped. He knew that if this ledger ever came to light, it would bring shame, not gratitude. It would turn his acts of grace into a weapon, and he was too good a man for that. He hid it away, trusting that its silence was more powerful than any spoken word. And now, that trust had been passed down to me, along with the rusty key and the scorn of my family. And here is the heart of it all. People like Mark and David, they look at a man like me, a man who worked with his hands, who sacrificed for his wife, who lived a simple life, and they see weakness. They see a lack of ambition. They think because I don't chase after the things they value, I must have nothing of value. They underestimated me because they could not imagine a world where wealth wasn't counted in dollars and square feet. They laughed at me for inheriting a ruin, never once suspecting that I was the one who had inherited the entire moral foundation of their own prosperity. They thought they were looking down on me, but they were the ones living in the basement. Sitting there, I felt a strange sense of peace. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable strength. I now held all the cards. Not the power to destroy them with the truth, but the power to live above their judgment, to render it completely meaningless. I would not confront them. I would not reveal a single word of what I'd found. To do so would be to use my grandfather's honor as a tool for my own vengeance, and that would be the greatest betrayal of all. His legacy was one of quiet dignity, and I would uphold it. Their punishment would be simple. They would never know. They would be left to wonder, forever trapped in their own shallow ignorance. I closed the ledger and placed it carefully back in the safe, next to the bonds. I locked the iron door, heard the solid luss of the bolt sliding home, and I knew what I had to do. I would use the money to bring this place back to life. Not as a business, but as a tribute. I would restore every board, every shelf, every pane of glass, until it looked exactly as it did the day my grandfather closed the doors. I would do it myself, with my own 2 hands. It would no longer be Arthur's Folly. It would be a monument, yes, but not to failure. It would be a monument to a quiet man's goodness, a silent testament to a truth that only I would ever know. And that was a victory greater than any they could ever imagine. I put the ledger and the bonds back into the safe, closed that heavy iron door, and heard the tumblers fall back into place with a satisfying thud. The sound sealed the past and opened up my future. I sat there on that dusty floor for a long time, just thinking. The temptation to march over to Mark's house, to slap that ledger down on his polished dining room table and watch the smug look drain from his face, was a hot, tempting coal in my gut. But the feeling passed. To do that would be to become like him, to use my grandfather's quiet grace as a cudgel for my own pride. That wasn't justice, it was just noise. My grandfather's legacy wasn't in the debts he was owed, but in the silence he kept. My path was clear. I would honor that silence. I would not say a word. The first step was practical. I couldn't just walk into the Oakhaven Bank with a stack of 70-year-old bearer bonds. The whole town would know my business before the ink was dry. I'm a carpenter, not a financier, but I know how small towns work. So, I took a bus to a city 3 counties over, a place where my name meant nothing. I found a quiet, respectable lawyer, a man with gray hair and kind eyes who didn't ask too many questions. We set up a trust, handled the bonds discreetly, and the money was transferred to an account that no one in Oakhaven would ever know existed. It wasn't a treasure to be flaunted. It was a tool. It was the means to buy my peace, to secure my final years, and most importantly, to do right by the memory of the man who built that store. My plan for the store itself became my sole focus. I wasn't going to sell it. I wasn't going to rent it out. I was going to bring it back to life, board by board, nail by nail. I would use my own hands, the skills I'd spent a lifetime honing, to restore every inch of it. I would replace the rotting timbers, reglaze the dusty windows, and polish that old oak counter until it shone like it did in 1950. It wouldn't be a business. It would be a museum of one, a private monument, not to failure, but to integrity, a place that looked exactly as it did when it was the heart of this town, preserved and perfect, a silent testament that only I would understand. It would be my life's final and most important project. The justice for Mark and David would be in their continued ignorance. They would drive by and see the old fool, Arthur, still patching up his folly. They'd see me, on a ladder, replacing a window, and shake their heads, whispering to each other about my stubborn pride and wasted pension. They would continue to pity me, to condescend to me at family dinners, and they would never, ever know the truth. They would never know that the very foundation of their comfortable lives was paid for by the man they scorned. Their punishment wasn't to be exposed. It was to be left behind, trapped forever in their shallow world of dollars and cents, blind to the real history that surrounded them. Their judgment had become completely irrelevant. In the end, I understood what I had truly inherited. It wasn't the building, and it wasn't the money. It was the truth held in that leather-bound book. That was the real fortune. People like my family look at an old building and see only rot and decay. They look at a simple life and see only failure. They are blind to the value of things that can't be counted or sold. They laughed at me for inheriting a ruin, but they were the ones living in poverty, a poverty of the spirit. I had found my grandfather's treasure, and I would spend the rest of my days honoring it. The store they called a monument to failure had become my fortress of dignity, and inside its quiet, restored walls, I was the richest man in town.